Illustrations can take any design to a new emotional level, from thought-provoking to serious or even full of happy energy. But how do you make sure your illustrations are packed with emotion? Let's have a look at 5 quick steps that you can apply to any illustration project. First, we need to choose our main subject. When we have a really clear main subject, it's a lot easier for us as people to relate to that one subject. And your subject can be a person, can be an animal, or even an inanimate object if you like. Sometimes it can be great to be very literal, like in this illustration that I created about mental health. Because it was a very heavy topic and we wanted to show the demographic in the actual illustration, I chose a young woman for this one. To help us connect even more with her, I also zoomed in very close, because we could have shown her from a far distance, which could have created a very different impression, maybe of being lonely, for example. But in this case, I wanted us to feel that emotion that she's feeling, so we are much more up close. For situations where we maybe don't just want one type of person to be able to relate, but we want lots of different people who look different to be able to relate, we can use an inanimate object, for example. In this scene, I've used books and a coffee cup to convey that sense of being calm and taking time for yourself. And that's something that anyone who's looking at this picture could relate to. To find inspiration for your main subject, I like to think about people that I already know. When we're thinking about someone that we know, we remember their quirks, their personality, their mannerisms, maybe things that they would wear, and otherwise it can be really easy to get stuck into things like what colors to use or the hairstyle that you're wanting to use. And these things are usually not as important for setting the mood. Try to think about the way that they smile, things that they would say, and maybe things that they would bring with them. Let's say they're going on a hike. What will they bring with them on that hike? If you're illustrating a subject that is not a person, you can still use this strategy. So you could say, for example, if my best friend would be a bunny, what would that look like? And you can translate that energy that your best friend has into that character. Next up, we can start to think about the overall composition. If you're illustrating for a magazine cover or let's say a website banner, you might want to put more work into your background and details. But if you're doing a spot illustration, for example, where let's say you would put it in a magazine or you would put it in a kid's book, you don't always have to flesh out the background as much. You could use a fading technique, for example, or only add little details around it. The supporting composition should help you highlight the subject even more and to help you add a little bit of details that enhance that mood that you're trying to create. For example, here I am drawing a happy mountain, and so the supporting composition could work with little mountains around it that are maybe a little bit less prominent, maybe a little bit of a lake in the foreground. And so we want to make sure that the composition that we're creating is helping us draw the eye to that main subject. You can do this through perspective, through the level of complexity in the background versus the subject, in color. So there's lots of different ways that you can use the composition and perspective to draw attention to your main subject and create that feeling that you're after. The point of view here is also a really helpful tool. So if we're looking at someone who is really sad, we might want to stand far away and see the perspectives of the walls coming in, for example, with that person being really small. If we're looking up at a starry sky and we want that sense of wonder, maybe we want to have a very wide perspective where we're getting in all the stars, for example. So try to think about the feeling that you want to create and how that perspective could work with you on that mission. Another great way to create emotion is to use interaction between either different characters or different inanimate objects and your main subject. So in this case, for example, we could have a little interaction between the mountain and the sun, for example. That would be a great way to all of a sudden add a lot more personality to the illustration. If you don't have multiple characters, you could have the relationship between, let's say, someone holding an object that they are very fond of. Or maybe it's a very sad scene where someone is looking at something from their mom who passed away, and that's creating the emotion, for example. So try to think about how to use interaction between your character or the main subject and other objects or characters in the scene. Next up, of course, we have to talk about color, because the colors you're using are going to massively impact the mood of the illustration. So if I wanted to make this mountain scene very calm, I would use tones that are very close to each other, probably lots of blues and greens that go very, very close tone in tone. If I wanted to create a lot more energy, or maybe it's a storm, I would maybe use very dark and very light shades to create a lot of contrast. So try to play around with the colors that you're using. The best way I have found to get really good results with this is to make sure that you're creating little thumbnails to experiment. So basically what I like to do is I like to take my sketch, make lots of duplicates of it that are little small thumbnails, and then on a layer underneath it, I can go and color in just with big blocks. And this helps me plan out different colors and I can see how that works overall. You could, of course, create the full illustration and then start tweaking the colors. I always find that a lot harder because you're much more attached to the illustration as it stands. And I like to do this thumbnail strategy to just quickly see all my options, and then I can pick one after that. If you feel like you've created your full illustration and you're just not quite happy with it, you can actually use Adobe Illustrator's recoloring tool as well. That's a really good option if you're working in Adobe Illustrator. Next up, we can work with textures. And this is where I find that illustration very often comes to life. So that could be maybe having a sweater that looks really fluffy and really cozy, or maybe having grass that looks really textural. It could be anything that is helping you add that textural element that helps something feel a little bit less digital, even if it is a very digital illustration. Having a pattern on some of the clothes or anything else that's bringing a bit more of that tactile feeling into illustration can be super helpful. You can add in texture either by having a separate layer where you're using a brush to go over different parts of your illustration and adding, let's say, stippling or different grunge effects. But you can also use texture just in the brush or the techniques that you're using. So one of my absolute favorites is when I'm working in Procreate, I use the dry brush that comes with Procreate. But in other tools like Fresco and Adobe Illustrator, there's also lots of brushes that you can play around with. And lastly, we really want to pay attention to the way that we work with lighting. So lighting could be both adding highlights or adding shadows, and this is going to have a huge impact on the mood of the illustration that you're creating. So what I like to do is to think about where the light source is coming from, and then we want to think about how intense that light source should be. So if we want something that feels a little bit scary or a little bit, like a super bright day maybe, might want to have that lighting be very intense. And if we want something that feels calmer, you can have something that feels a lot more even, so not such harsh shadows and harsh highlights. To add the highlights and the shadows, I then like to add new layers, so one for highlights and one for shadows, for example. And then I like to start by just adding in all the highlights on areas that would be hit by that light source. So you can think about how thick you want to make those areas, how saturated you want to make those areas, and you can play around with different blend modes to get that effect that you want. And then on the opposite side, where we're not getting the light, you can add shadows. And these can be in big swatches, it could be just being shadows from certain objects. And sometimes we might have to use reference images from real life to start to understand where those shadows would actually naturally fall. But this stage of adding highlights and little details and shadows is usually where the illustration really starts to come to life. I hope these tips got you really excited to start illustrating and creating illustrations with lots of emotion in them. If you want to become a really flexible illustrator who can take on lots of different styles, I'm actually releasing a course now on March 28th. All about illustration for branding, where you have different styles for every project and how to actually tackle that. It's going to be available both on Skillshare and on our website. So as soon as it's out, I'll make sure to link it down in the description. But if you're watching this before March 28th, make sure to give us a follow because I'm going to post in the YouTube community as well as soon as it's out. In the meantime, if you want to learn more about illustration, go check out this video where I answer all of your different illustration questions. Thank you so much for watching. Good luck with your projects and see you next time.